me ask you, what was Thanksgiving like when you were growing up? What was it like for your family to celebrate the Thanksgiving holiday? I know for mine, it was a big deal. I remember when I was growing up, when I was younger, Thanksgiving was a big gathering and celebration. Some of you might know I'm from a large family. My dad is one of 11 kids. And when I was younger growing up, the whole family got together. All 11 of the kids, most of them had children, one or two even had grandchildren. And we would all come together at my Aunt Taffy's house. She was the oldest of the 11, and she graciously hosted us each year for Thanksgiving. We would gather at her house. We would come in several hours before the Thanksgiving dinner, and we would spend that time fellowshipping, talking, communing with one another, catching up on what's been happening. Most of the families would bring a dish or two to share with everyone. Several of the women might gather in the kitchen and get the last of the things in the oven, the food prepared. And it was the same after we ate too. We would stay for several hours into the night, just enjoying being with one another, spending time together, and watching the Thanksgiving football game. The dinner was always good, tons of turkey and other meats with all of the trimmings, and just about any side you could want to go with your Thanksgiving dinner. I miss those times. It's been a long time since we've celebrated Thanksgiving quite like that. But there's one thing about those gatherings that I remember that maybe wasn't as happy. This might be similar for many of you too. It was really probably just logistics that this happened, but as you can imagine, with that many people, there wasn't a table or even a room by itself that could seat everyone. So the adults would all gather in the dining room and the living room with tables set up, and the kids would gather together in the kitchen at the kids' table. I remember thinking when I was younger, when do I get to go in the other room with them? When am I going to be welcomed at that table as one of the adults? Did you know Israel had a Thanksgiving celebration? It wasn't quite what we're used to. It didn't look the same, and it didn't happen once a year. But it happened regularly. Almost daily, there was a Thanksgiving celebration taking place at the tabernacle or in the temple. We've been studying the last couple of weeks, and we'll have a couple more weeks looking at the sacrifice of ancient Israel. The sacrifices prescribed and detailed for us in the book of Leviticus. The method, the nature of worship as God detailed it to the people of Israel when He was establishing them as His holy nation. We've looked already at the whole burnt offering, the offering of submission and devotion to God, where the entire animal was placed on the altar and consumed by the fire. We've looked at the grain offering, the offering of the labor, the fruits of the field, the offering of the first fruits, the first gatherings of the harvest each season, the offering of thanks to God for His provision. And as we've studied these two, we've seen several points or lessons in these sacrifices. We've seen that the Lord accepts and communes with those who come into His presence through the death of an atoning sacrifice. We've seen that that atoning sacrifice should be something costly, should be something that cost not just the life of the animal, but that was a significant offering from the people of Israel. We've seen that those sacrifices should therefore be the best that was available. Sacrifices without blemish or defect or flaw or ailment. Sacrifices unadulterated by yeast and leaven. We've seen that those sacrifices were to be brought willingly, voluntarily, not simply out of obedience, but out of a desire to be in close relationship with God. All of this applies to Israel's thanksgiving sacrifice as well, their celebration of fellowship and communion. And at that celebration, there was no kids' table, but all were invited to join in the meal of the Lord's fellowship. Let's learn a little bit more about this third sacrifice as we find it in Leviticus. And I'm going to do something I don't typically do or enjoy doing as often, but we're going to look at a few different passages in Leviticus to get the full picture of what this sacrifice entailed. So look with me first at Leviticus chapter 3. Leviticus chapter 3, just beginning there at verse 1. We see the first introduction of what comes to be known as the peace offering or the fellowship offering. God speaking to Moses, speaking to Israel through Moses, said, when his offering is a sacrifice of a peace offering, if he offers it of the herd, whether male or female, he shall offer it without blemish before the Lord. And he shall lay his hand on the head of his offering and kill it at the door of the tabernacle of meeting. And Aaron's sons, the priests, shall sprinkle the blood all around on the altar. Then he shall offer from the sacrifice of the peace offering an offering made by fire to the Lord, the fat that covers the entrails and all the fat that is on the entrails, the 2 kidneys and the fat that is on them by the flanks, and the fatty lobe attached to the liver above the kidneys he shall remove. And Aaron's sons shall burn it on the altar upon the burnt sacrifice, which is on the wood that is on the fire, as an offering made by fire, a sweet aroma to the Lord. The rest of chapter 3, just like we saw with the whole burnt offering, gives prescription for those who couldn't afford to bring from the herd, to bring a bull. Almost identical description for bringing a lamb from the flock. Or if that was too much, bringing a goat. But in chapter 7, we begin to see a little bit more about this sacrifice and this celebration. So let's jump to chapter 7 then, beginning at verse 11. This is the law of the sacrifice of peace offerings, which he shall offer to the Lord. If he offers it for a thanksgiving, then he shall offer with the sacrifice of thanksgiving unleavened cakes mixed with oil, unleavened wafers anointed with oil, or cakes of blended flour mixed with oil. Besides the cakes, as his offering, he shall offer leavened bread with the sacrifice of thanksgiving of his peace offering. And from it he shall offer 1 cake from each offering as a heave offering to the Lord. It shall belong to the priest who sprinkles the blood of the peace offering. The flesh of the sacrifice of his peace offering for thanksgiving shall be eaten the same day it is offered. He shall not leave any of it until morning, but if the sacrifice of his offering is a vow or a voluntary offering, it shall be eaten the same day that he offers his sacrifice. But on the next day, the remainder of it also may be eaten. The remainder of the flesh of the sacrifice on the 3rd day must be burned with fire. And if any of the flesh of the sacrifice of his peace offering is eaten at all on the 3rd day, it shall not be accepted, nor shall be imputed to him. It shall be an abomination to him who offers it, and the person who eats of it shall bear guilt. So we've seen some idea of when these offerings would be brought. We've seen basic outline of how the offering would be brought and what parts of it would be given to the Lord. But if we jump down to verse 28, we get the final piece of this celebration. He continues there, "Then the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, Speak to the children of Israel, saying, He who offers the sacrifice of his peace offering to the Lord shall bring his offering to the Lord from the sacrifice of his peace offering. His own hands shall bring the offerings made by fire to the Lord. The fat with the breast he shall bring, that the breast may be waved as a wave offering before the Lord. And the priest shall burn the fat on the altar, but the breast shall be Aaron's and his sons. Also the right thigh you shall give to the priest as a heave offering from the sacrifices of your peace offerings. He among the sons of Aaron who offers the blood of the peace offering and the fat shall have the right thigh for his part. For the breast of the wave offering and the thigh of the heave offering I have taken from the children of Israel, from the sacrifices of their peace offerings, and I have given them to Aaron, the priest, and to his sons from the children of Israel by a statute forever. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. All right, let's look at what's actually going on here and what all of this means. God is continuing in his explanation, in his description of the offerings he desires for Israel to bring as they come to him in worship. This is now the third offering we've considered, the third type of sacrifice that we've seen described. And it's similar to that first one, the whole burnt offering, if you remember that. He brings an animal from the herd, a bull or even a cow. Or he brings a lamb, or he brings a goat. And just like with the whole burnt offering, he presents it before the priest to examine and make sure that it is without defect, that it is an acceptable offering. And then the individual person himself slaughters the animal there at the altar of the Lord in the temple or in the tabernacle. The priest collects its blood and he sprinkles it or pours it around the base of the altar. So far, it's very similar to what we've already seen, with just a couple of differences, one being that the sacrifice could be male or female. To me, that says all are welcome at the table of the Lord. We've seen in the description there in Leviticus why someone might bring this offering, where it fits within the life and the worship of Israel. There were 3 reasons explained. One was that it could be a thanks offering, giving thanks to God. That could be general, thanks for the removal of guilt, thanks for the atoning of sin, but often that was for something even more specific. It was thanks for a prayer that has been answered. It was thanks for a particular blessing that God had given to the worshiper, to the one bringing the sacrifice. Leviticus said that it might be in fulfillment of a vow. Somebody makes a vow to God. They vow, like maybe you've done at some point in your life, Lord, if you will just save me from this, bring me through this, then I will dedicate my life to you. Then I will, many preachers I've heard of say, Lord, if you will just save me, then I will become your preacher. This would be given as a fulfillment of that vow, to celebrate the vows fulfilled. A good example from Israelites' own history would be the Nazirite vow. Those who were pledged to God as special leaders, servants of his, the Nazirites, like Samson was. Usually that vow was for a specific time frame, 7 years. And at the end of that, they would bring this fellowship or peace offering to rejoice at the fulfillment of their vows. Or it could be a free will offering, an offering brought voluntarily just to say thanks, just to reestablish fellowship with God. And it was for this reason then that this offering usually accompanied and followed the other sacrifices. When you brought the whole burnt offering, when you brought the offering for sin or for trespasses, then along with it you might bring as well the peace offering, celebrating the remission of sin, celebrating the reunion with God, signifying the peace and the relationship which is restored through the other sacrifices. But there's one big difference in this sacrifice from all of the others. And I want to focus on that this morning. I want us to look at that one main difference, because I think in that we find the true purpose and the fuller meaning for this particular sacrifice. It's called often the peace offering, sometimes the fellowship or even the communion offering. The word there in Hebrew, the title for this offering, seems to come from the same root as shalom, the Hebrew word for peace. The offering itself seems to indicate that its primary purpose was to establish and to celebrate peace with God now. It was followed by a meal. It was followed by a meal. After the animal was brought and sacrificed, after it was slaughtered and God's portion was placed on the altar, after the other pieces were given to the priest, the rest was given back to the individual. It was given back to him as his portion, his meal, and it was prepared right there in the temple, and it was shared as a fellowship meal with his friends, with his family, with all those who were gathered in the temple at that time. It was a joyous celebration. It was joy over the remission of sins. It was joy for the restored peace with God. It was joy for the fellowship now being recognized and enjoyed, not just with God, but with the community of God's people. But there are some insights in this. There are insights that help us to see what is involved in establishing this fellowship of God, what it takes to bring us back into the peace that we so desperately seek with our divine Creator. Number one, we see that the fellowship and communion with God are experienced only through the shedding of the blood of a perfect and substitutionary sacrifice. We've already seen that forgiveness of sins required the shedding of blood, required a substitute sacrificed in our place, who could take our sin in a sense upon itself and atone for us before God. But we are seeing even further now that that only goes so far. To establish the relationship, to bring the peace, further sacrifice was necessary. Through sacrifice, sin was atoned. Through sacrifice, guilt is removed. And through sacrifice on our behalf, peace then also is restored, and fellowship may be known with God again. This offering follows those which atone for sin. It is a thank offering. It is a celebration. It is a party, a festival to which all are invited and welcome to sit at the table and know and enjoy the peace and fellowship of God, which is now restored and reestablished. With sin removed, this following offering is meant to restore that relationship that has been broken. It is a lesson for us even today that sin and guilt are atoned for, that fellowship is restored with God only through the shed blood of a perfect substitutionary sacrifice. I thank God that He has made that sacrifice for us. I thank God that we no longer need to bring the animals into the sanctuary to sacrifice on the altar, but He has paid that price for us and restored that peace now. But second, we see communion with God is possible only through surrender to Him. Only by surrendering ourselves to Him and following His instruction and His guidance is peace fully and truly restored and enjoyed. We see that in the parts of the animal as they are sacrificed and given. Some are given to God, the innards. Perhaps the greatest part. To us, the fat doesn't sound like a good thing. In our health-conscious society, we think, that's not the best part. That's the most unhealthy part. But in the culture of ancient Israel, the fat, especially the inner fat and the inner organs, they were a delicacy. They were a symbol of health and prosperity. Even today, many of us consider those inner organs to be delicacies. The liver, the gizzards of the turkey at Thanksgiving, perhaps even the heart of the animal. If you're a hunter or if you live with a hunter, maybe you're familiar with this. Taking the liver from the deer you have killed, that's a delicacy, that's a treat. That's an honor for the one who killed it, or a great gift to someone else. The best parts of the animal are given to God. We could go even deeper than that, though. That's a symbol, an image to us that our best parts, our inner parts, are reserved for God. If this meal is a celebration of restored relationship, then this is a reminder to us today that our best and our inner self are also reserved for God. There's other ways that they surrendered to God in establishing that peace. The breast and the right thigh were given to the priest. Relationship with God is not purely a private matter. It is a religious matter as well. The priest was the mediator of that covenant relationship that restored fellowship. We don't have priests today. I'm not a priest. I don't need to mediate your relationship or even your worship of God. That's not why I'm here. What I'm here to do is to help lead in that worship. I'm here to help deepen that relationship through teaching, through preaching, perhaps even through counseling and instruction. But I'm not a priest. I'm not a mediator for you and God, because you can go to Him directly now. There's no longer a need for a priest. Our perfect and eternal high priest has already come. He sits now at the right hand of God the Father in heaven, where He mediates on our behalf, where He mediates that covenant relationship between us and God. Lastly, the rest of the animal that's returned to the worshiper, to the person of Israel, to the one making the sacrifice, and it is all eaten together there in the temple. He sits down with his friends and his family, with all of those of the community of Israel that are gathered in the temple at that time. They sit down together and they enjoy this animal, this lamb, which has been sacrificed for the restoration of peace. Relationship with God is not purely a private matter. It includes all the worshiping community of God's redeemed people. When we find forgiveness, when we experience peace from God, we share that with one another. We celebrate that together in the community of His people. Thirdly, how is peace established? Peace is established when we come together and worship and in fellowship with God, proclaiming and rejoicing at the mercy He has revealed. We give testimony in front of others before the congregation to how God has been faithful to us. We give testimony for how He has provided for our needs, how His vows are fulfilled, how His grace is shown, how our sin has been forgiven and removed. This was the practice of Israel during the fellowship offerings. When they brought the animal before the altar and slaughtered it, as the priest laid it on the fire, the one bringing it would begin to proclaim aloud why he brought this sacrifice, what great thing God had done, why he was giving thanks. We see an example of this when Hannah comes before the altar bringing her young son Samuel. Recently born, she gives thanks to God for prayers fulfilled. She brought 3 young bulls and an ephah of flour to the tabernacle. Above and beyond, she brought the fellowship sacrifice and the grain offering to give thanks for the prayer which God had answered. And she proclaimed then at the tabernacle in front of the congregation, why she was rejoicing, what God had done for her. Even our call to worship this morning, Psalm 107, it's a psalm which calls us to proclaim in front of others the mercy and the praise of God. Later in Israel's history, as the temple was built, it became one of the psalms sung or recited when the fellowship offerings were brought. This is a meal of fellowship and communion with God. And that celebration includes the whole worshiping community. All are welcomed at this table. We are welcome to the table of our Lord to celebrate His grace and then to enjoy His peace offered to us. It is a party. It is a feast of rejoicing at the peace which has been restored, at the peace which we can all experience and know now. This is God's people, recognizing we have been estranged from Him. This is God's people, realizing we cannot repair that relationship on our own. But the shed blood of a substitutionary sacrifice does that for us. And now that that sacrifice has been made, now that atonement has been obtained, now that peace and fellowship with God are restored, we join in the meal of God's peace. Friends, Jesus was the one who made this possible for us. When He went to that cross, when He shed His blood, when He stood in our place and gave up His life as the sacrifice for us, He not only atoned for our sins, but He became our peace offering. Peace. The fellowship offering, the communion meal there in the temple was for Israel a foreshadowing of the real offering that was to come, of the one who would establish final and complete peace between God and His people. Being justified through the Lamb that was slain for us. Being justified for Jesus of Nazareth who went to the cross for us. Being restored into relationship through faith in Him. We now have peace with God. This communion meal, this Last Supper, this Lord's Supper, this is for us the new fellowship offering. The substance of the meal is that lamb which has been slain in our place. He is the sacrifice that has restored peace with God now and forevermore. That's the whole point of all of this, isn't it? That's the whole point of us coming to God looking for relationship. That's the whole point of our prayers and our faith. It is to be restored in relationship with the divine Creator. It is to know peace and fellowship with Him. It is to know communion with the one who stands over all. It is to experience true peace. The sacrifices of Israel, they were joyous, despite the blood spilled, despite the death, despite the fire of the altar. They were joyous occasions of celebration because they assured the community that God has atoned for sin, that eternal and spiritual death has been avoided, that fellowship is now restored, that peace can be found and known in this life. The final securing, the assurance of all this is found in the death of our Lord Jesus Christ. His resurrection is evidence of the sacrifice made and accepted by God. His ascension into heaven is our hope for what is to come. His presence, His peace, His truth, and His hope, they are all signified and sealed upon our hearts as we join in the fellowship communion meal. And all who receive, all who believe in Jesus as their salvation, Each and every one are welcomed at this table.